Late one night, the front door of a tiny field clinic on the African plain began to shake. On the step, a gaunt lioness gently laid down her last surviving cub, barely breathing, then stepped back, staring straight at the widowed veterinarian whose hand trembled on the latch. That night, a predator broke her own instincts. An old debt quietly woke up, and the choice to open or keep shut. That door would decide not only the life of a dying cub, but the rest of the woman's life as well. The night had grown thin and brittle over the savanna, as if even the sky were tired of holding itself up. Naima moved through the dry grass like a fading shadow, her ribs showing faintly beneath her coat, where the good seasons had once left a soft layer of strength. Now there was only dust, and the quiet breathing of the one small body draped across her shoulders. Kito was lighter than he should have been. When he was born, he had been the smallest of the litter, always scrambling to find a place at her belly, always pushed aside by bigger brothers and sisters. Back then, he had been noisy, insistent, a tiny scrap of defiance with blue eyes and a squeaky roar. Now his paws dangled loosely against her neck, and his breath came in shallow, uneven pulls, hot against the side of her throat. The others were gone. One by one, sickness had taken them, stealing strength first, then appetite, then the light from their eyes. Naima had licked their fevered faces, pressed her body around their trembling sides, and listened helplessly as their breathing slowed. She had carried each small, limp body to a patch of soft earth beneath a thorn tree, and covered them gently with soil, nose lingering over the fresh mounds until the scent of them blurred with dust and salt. The male who had once guarded them had gone too. He had limped away after a fight with strangers at the edge of the territory, leaving only the bitter musk of his blood and the memory of his roaring behind. Since then, Naima had walked alone, her world narrowed to the frail, determined heartbeat of Kito. That heartbeat was weaker now. All day she had hunted, chasing thin antelope and sharp-eyed warthogs, her legs burning, lungs on fire. Each time she returned to the thicket where Kito lay, his eyes were glassier, his mouth drier, his body hotter beneath her tongue. The smells of infection and exhaustion clung to him, wrong and heavy. As darkness settled, Naima lifted him once more and began to walk, not toward familiar hunting grounds, but toward the far edge of her memory. There, beyond the scattered acacias and the rusted wire of the old fence line, a faint, unnatural glow trembled against the horizon. It was not moonlight. It was the steady, stubborn light of humans. Naima paused, feeling Kito's chest flutter weakly against her fur. Instinct tugged her back toward the safety of the tall grass, away from the world of fire, metal, and shouting voices. But another force, older than instinct, pushed her forward, the fierce, aching refusal to bury one more cub. She lowered her head and kept walking toward the distant yellow light. There had been other nights, back when the drought was younger and her own strength still sat heavy on her bones, when Naima had seen that strange glow on the horizon. It was not the cold highlight of the stars, nor the calm, broad wash of the moon. It was a stubborn, yellow square of brightness pressed low to the ground, flickering behind the thin line of old fence and scrub. On those nights she had turned away, guiding her cubs toward familiar cover and familiar prey. The smell of humans, even from a distance, carried metal, smoke, and an unease that every wild thing understood. Tonight the glow was closer. Or perhaps she was the one who had come closer, forced in by hunger and by the desperate heat pouring from Kito's body. His fur was damp where her tongue had passed again and again over his face and paws, trying to soothe what would not be soothed. Every few steps she felt a small tremor run through him, a shiver that had nothing to do with the night air. Beyond the last scattering of acacia trees, the land opened into a shallow basin of pale dust and thorn bush. In the distance, framed by a rough fence and a dirt track, the square of light held steady. Around it, shadows moved now and then, two-legged and upright, accompanied by softer noises. A door closing, the faint scrape of something metal, the far-off murmur of a human voice. The scents drifting toward Naima were thick with medicine, strange oils, and the weaker, familiar smell of other animals. She shifted Kito's weight, meaning to circle wide and test the edge of that place before going closer. That was when she heard the laughter. It rose from a low hollow to her left, a broken, cackling chorus she knew too well. Hyenas. She stopped, ears pricked, head high. The sound of bones grinding and wet tearing drifted to her on the wind. A fresh kill. Under other stars, in other seasons, she might have turned aside, avoided trouble. Tonight, trouble had already found her. One of the hyenas lifted its head from the carcass, muzzle darkened, and stared. It saw a tired lioness and a cub that could not stand. Easy meat. It barked a harsh note, and others followed its gaze. They came at her in a loose half-circle, shoulders rolling, spots shifting over their hides. Kito stirred weakly as Naima eased him from her jaws down into the thin grass, placing one broad paw protectively over his small side. She lowered her head and answered the hyenas with a growl that came from somewhere deep in her chest, a sound that remembered every cub she had already lost. The first hyena darted in, snapping for Kito's tail, and Naima met it with a roar that split the quiet. She struck hard, her claws raking air and dust as the animal twisted away, only to feel teeth clamp down on her shoulder from the other side. Pain flared hot, shocking and bright. But she twisted in two, turning her weight, driving the attacker back with the full force of her body. Dust rose around them. The carcass was forgotten. The hyenas circled, testing, but found no opening. Every time one darted close, Naima was there, a barrier of muscle and rage between them and the cub at her feet. Her breath came heavy and fast, the wound in her shoulder burning, but she did not step aside. At last, with a series of frustrated yelps and short, resentful laughs, the pack turned away. There were easier meals in the dark. They melted back into the hollow, voices fading. Naima stood trembling, the leg beneath the bitten shoulder aching with each heartbeat. She glanced down. Kito's eyes were open just a sliver, reflecting the distant yellow square. His chest still moved, shallow but steady. She nudged him gently, then lifted him once more. The taste of her own blood mingled with his scent as she adjusted her grip. Limping, stubborn, she turned again toward the forbidden light and went on. On the edge of the basin, the light resolved itself into a small house with a flat roof and a narrow porch set behind a sagging fence and a metal gate that did not quite close. A single rectangle of yellow spilled out from a large front window, painting a pale path across the packed earth. Naima stopped just beyond the reach of that light and lowered Kito gently to the ground. His sides fluttered like the wings of an injured bird. Inside, Dr. Amina Jaleel rinsed her hands at a steel sink, listening to the soft ticking of cooling metal and the quiet hum of a small refrigerator full of medicine. The day had been long, filled with coughing village dogs and one frightened goat with a broken leg. Now the rooms had settled into the familiar hush that came after work, when she could almost hear the echo of a voice that no longer answered hers. She dried her hands slowly, her gaze drifting to a photograph on the wall of a man in a ranger's uniform, smiling against a backdrop of tall grass. The dog that slept near the back door lifted its head. A low whine slipped from its throat. Amina frowned. The dog was not a timid animal. It barked at delivery trucks and stray donkeys without hesitation. Tonight, though, it stood and backed into a corner, tail tucked, eyes fixed on the front of the house. Then she heard it, A faint thud, as if something had bumped the step outside. Another sound followed, a soft scrape across the door. Amina moved to the window and parted the curtain with 2 fingers. For a moment, her mind refused to name what she saw. A lioness stood in the yard, larger than any dog, head held low, shoulders heavy with fatigue. Her coat bore the dull sheen of hard times, and there was a dark patch on one shoulder where the fur was matted. At her feet, half on the bottom step, lay a small, limp shape. Amina's breath caught. The cub's paws were too still. Even through the glass, she could see the shallow rise and fall of its chest, the way its mouth hung slightly open as if each breath hurt. The lioness shifted then, and to Amina's astonishment, she eased the cub higher onto the step with her muzzle and took 3 slow steps back. Her head lowered, not in preparation to spring, but in something that looked very much like waiting. The phone on the table buzzed sharply, making Amina jump. She grabbed it without taking her eyes from the scene outside. "Amina, it's Samuel," came the rough voice of the old ranger. "We picked up movement near your place. Big cat. Stay inside, lock your doors. I'm on my way, and if she comes close, I'll have to put her down." Naima heard the distant rumble of an engine somewhere beyond the fence, smelled the faint trace of fuel on the air. She did not move. Her gaze stayed fixed on the rectangle of light and the shadowed figure behind the glass. Between them, on the worn stone of the doorstep, Kito lay where she had placed him, halfway between the wild and the world of humans. For a long breath, Amina stood frozen by the window, the phone pressed to her ear, Samuel's warning buzzing like an insect in the background. Outside, the lioness did not pace or lunge. She simply stood, muscles drawn tight, eyes fixed on the door, as if every hope she had left in the world lay on that worn stone step. "Amina, did you hear me?" Samuel insisted. "Stay inside. Do not open that door." "I hear you," she said quietly, though she was no longer sure whom she was answering. Her gaze fell to the small body on the step. Years of training moved through her mind in quick, steady lines. The cub's sides rose and fell too fast, each inhale shallow and struggling. The belly was drawn in, the mouth slightly open, tongue dry. Even from a distance, she could see the dull glaze of fever in the half-closed eyes. She had seen this look before, in wild dogs, in antelope, once in a young lion that had not lived to see another sunrise. She remembered that night as clearly as if it were happening again. Juma's hands steady on the animal's flank, her own fingers pressing down on the chest as they tried, breath after breath, to bring it back. The smell of disinfectant, the quiet alarm of a monitor, and then a long, flat line. Afterward, in the heavy silence, Juma had said, "We cannot win them all, Amina, but we must keep opening the door." She had not opened many doors since he died. Now, on her doorstep, another wild heartbeat was fading. Between her and that fading life stood only a few inches of wood and metal and the weight of every fear she had carried since the night she lost her husband. "Amina," Samuel said again, more urgent now, "I'm close. Do not do anything foolish." She lowered the phone, ending the call without answering. Her hands shook as she reached for the chain and the bolt. The dog whimpered, pressing itself tighter into the corner. The lioness outside lifted her head at the faint rattle of metal, ears pricking forward. Amina opened the door a crack. The night air rushed in, warm and dry, carrying the thick scent of lion, dust, and the sharp, sour tang of sickness. For one suspended moment, human and lioness faced each other across the narrow threshold. Naima's eyes were wide, gold catching the light, not wild with attack, but bright with strain, with something that looked very much like pleading. Slowly, keeping her movements small and careful, Amina slid one hand out through the gap and curled her fingers around the loose skin at the back of the cub's neck. Kito's fur was hot, his body light as if half of him had already drifted away. She drew him in, inch by inch, until he was inside the circle of her arms. The instant Kito left the stone, Naima lurched forward with a low, tearing sound that was almost a roar and almost a cry. Amina yanked the cub inside and slammed the door, throwing the bolt just as Naima's weight struck the other side. The whole frame shuddered. The dog yelped. Outside, the lioness hurled herself at the barrier again, claws scraping, her voice filling the yard with a deep, broken thunder. She could no longer see her cub. Every instinct in her screamed to break through, to follow. Inside, Amina clutched Kito to her chest and hurried toward the treatment table. The cub's heart fluttered against her fingers in a frantic, failing rhythm. As she laid him down beneath the bright examination light, she saw the pattern she had dreaded, the swollen glands, the crusted nose, the telltale signs of an infection that moved fast and showed no mercy. Samuel's truck engine grew louder on the road outside. Naima's roars beat against the walls like waves. In the narrow space between them, under the steady beam of the lamp, a single small life lay balanced on the thin edge between two worlds, waiting to see which door would truly open. The little clinic seemed to shrink around the sound of Naima's fury. Each time she struck the door, the frame rattled, metal singing in protest. Bottles on a nearby shelf trembled, their labels whispering against one another. Inside, beneath the overhead lamp, Kito lay on a faded towel, his paws limp, his breaths a thin, rapid flutter. Amina worked quickly, the movements of her hands practiced, but not automatic. She clipped away a bit of fur to place a line, slid a needle into the loose skin and taped it in place, then fitted a small mask over the cub's nose and mouth. The machine at his side chirped uncertainly, searching for a rhythm to read. His heart answered in weak, stumbling beats. A crash from the front jolted her. The door held, but she could hear claws scraping, the low, breaking roar as Naima threw herself against the barrier that separated her from her cub. For a moment, Amina's own heart pounded in time with the struggle outside. She forced herself to breathe, to look past fear, to see what needed seeing. She moved to the window that overlooked the yard, just long enough to pull the curtain aside. Naima stood there, chest heaving, sides streaked with dust. Under the porch light, Amina saw it clearly for the first time, the pale, twisted line of scar tissue along the lioness's shoulder, where fur grew in a rough, uneven patch over an old wound. She knew that scar. She had seen its raw, open shape years before, when a young ranger in a pressed uniform had called her out at dusk to help a trapped lioness. Juma had stood between the snarling, terrified animal and the hunter's steel jaws, speaking softly as they worked to free her. Amina had cleaned the torn flesh, stitched it, and watched as those golden eyes glared at her with wild pain and confused trust. Now those same eyes stared up at her porch. Naima, for her part, smelled something beneath the sharp sting of fear, the dry, clean bite of the same medicine that had eased the fire in her shoulder long ago, and a quieter scent that clung to the woman behind the glass. Not the man's scent she remembered, but something that echoed it, the echo of hands that had once turned her away from death. Gravel crunched outside the fence as Samuel's truck rolled to a stop. The engine cut off, leaving only Naima's rough breathing and the steady hum of the clinic's lights. Samuel stepped out, rifle cradled in his arms, eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the lioness banging at the door. "Easy now," he murmured to himself, though no one was near enough to hear. He lifted the rifle, sighting along the barrel, aiming for the broad chest that could break a door in two. Naima turned her head at the movement, and the porch light caught her shoulder just right. Samuel hesitated. That scar, white and ropey against tawny fur, pulled a memory from the back of his mind, a trap, a call for help. Juma's laugh as the freed lioness limped away into the grass. "You again," he whispered. Inside, the monitor by Kito's head gave a sudden, high-pitched squeal. Amina spun back to the table. The shaky peaks on the screen flattened into a single, unbroken line. Under her fingers, the tiny chest fell still. For an instant, lioness and woman, yard and clinic, past and present, all hung suspended on the same terrible, silent beat. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into forever, there was nothing. The line on the monitor stayed flat and pale, a quiet road with no hills. Kito's chest lay still beneath the light, fur barely stirring under Amina's trembling hands. The sound of Naima's roaring faded into a dull echo at the edges of her hearing, swallowed by a roaring of her own pulse. "No," Amina whispered, though no one was there to answer. Not this time, not again. Her training took over where hope threatened to fail. She pressed her palms gently but firmly over Kito's small chest, counting under her breath as she pushed, letting the ribs spring back before pressing again. After a few compressions, she tilted his head, sealed her mouth over the mask, and gave him a careful breath, watching for the rise of his tiny rib cage. Nothing. Outside, Naima had gone past fury into something more raw. Her claws tore furrows in the ground near the doorframe. Each time she rammed her weight against the metal, the impact carried up through the boards and into the soles of Amina's feet. The lioness's voice was hoarse now, her roars breaking into rough, pleading sounds that did not sound like a hunter at all, but like a mother losing her grip on the last thing she had. Samuel stood by the truck, rifle still raised, but no longer steady. Sweat trickled down the side of his neck as he watched the scene. The lioness was close enough now that he could see the foam at the corner of her mouth, the way her muscles shook with exhaustion. One clean shot would stop her, end the risk to the woman inside. But his finger stayed off the trigger. Juma's old words drifted back to him. Sometimes the wild puts its trust in us. That is a debt we don't forget. Inside, Amina reached for a small vial, drew up a measured dose of medicine with hands that were steadier than her heart. It was strong, meant to wake failing hearts and lazy vessels. On a cub this week, it could be a mercy or a final push over the edge. "I'm with you," she murmured to the still form, as if the little body could hear. "We go one more time." She slid the needle beneath the skin, pushed the plunger, then returned to her rhythm. Press, release, breath, and then another breath. The monitor stayed flat, stubborn in its silence. Outside, Naima's fury finally broke. She stopped striking the door and instead pressed her forehead against it, sides heaving, a low, trembling sound spilling from her throat. Her body sagged toward the earth as if the weight of the sky had settled on her shoulders. In the bright, narrow room, Amina did not stop. Her arms ached, and her own breath came in gasps, but she kept going, counting softly, willing some hidden spark to answer. The room seemed to lean in with her, every bottle and metal tray listening. The line on the monitor held its breath, as if the world itself were deciding which way this night would turn. The silence broke with a single tentative sound. The flat line on the monitor twitched, then rose in a small, uncertain peak. A sharp beep cut through the air, so soft at first that Amina thought she had imagined it. She froze, hands still on Kito's chest, afraid that any movement might scare the fragile rhythm away. Another peak, another beep, faint, irregular, but there. Under her fingertips, she felt it, a tiny flutter deep inside the cub's ribs, like a bird testing its wings. His chest lifted, just enough to stir the fur beneath the mask, then fell again in a slow, shallow exhale. It was not strong, it was not safe, but it was life, turning back toward her after standing at the edge. Amina let out a breath she had not known she was holding. It came out as a shaky laugh that turned into a sob halfway through. For a brief, dizzy moment she saw another table, another monitor, the line that had never risen again. Juma's quiet face as the machines went still. The weight of helplessness that had settled on her shoulders that night had never truly left. Now, in this small room, a different story was unfolding. She adjusted the mask on Kito's face, checked the line at his leg, and stroked one small paw with the back of her finger. "Stay with me," she whispered. "You're not done yet." Outside, Naima stiffened. Through the door she could not see her cub, but something in the air had changed. The harsh scent of panic had thinned, replaced by a steadier rhythm beneath the hum of the building. She pressed her ear to the metal, listening. No flat, final quiet came to meet her, only the soft shuffle of human feet and the faint new beat of a heart refusing to quit. Her own breathing eased. The sounds tearing from her throat softened into a low, rumbling note that was closer to a purr than a roar. At the truck, Samuel lowered his rifle. He listened to the lioness's voice change and shook his head slowly. "All right, old girl," he murmured. "We'll see how this plays out." Time slipped by in slow minutes as Amina monitored the tiny rises and falls on the screen. When she was satisfied that the new rhythm was holding, she lifted Kito gently, cradling him against her chest. His eyes blinked once, unfocused but open. The fever had not broken, but a narrow path had opened through the night. She walked back to the front door and unlatched it with care. The dog whined but did not move from its corner. Amina opened the door just enough for warm air to pass between inside and out. Naima was there, as she knew she would be, a solid shape in the porch light. The lioness took one step forward, then stopped, head low, eyes searching. Amina held Kito so that his small face was level with the narrow gap. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Kito's nose twitched. He sniffed, catching the deep, familiar scent of his mother through the crack. His paw lifted weakly, pressing against the space where wood and metal met. Naima leaned in until her whiskers brushed the doorframe. She exhaled a long, shuddering breath, and the sound vibrated softly through the metal into Kito's bones. He blinked, the faintest spark of recognition flickering there, and his paw slid down, leaving a small smear of warmth on the cool surface. Behind them, out beyond the fence, a pair of headlights swept briefly across the road. A truck slowed, its engine rumbling low. Someone inside lifted a phone, the screen glowing blue as they snapped a quick picture of the lioness standing guard at the clinic door. "Mark this place," a voice said, almost lost beneath the wind. "We may come back." The truck moved on, its lights shrinking into the dark. Naima did not turn to watch it go. Her attention stayed fixed on the doorway and the fragile heartbeat just beyond it, beating now in answer to her own. Dawn came slowly to the little clinic, softening the hard lines of the night. The yard still bore the marks of struggle. Deep gouges in the dirt where Naima's claws had dug in, a smear of dried blood by the step where her shoulder had brushed the frame. But inside, the light that burned above the examination table felt warmer than it had in years. Kito slept, wrapped in a thin blanket, the mask replaced by a small tube that gave him easy air. His breaths were still shallow, but they were steady now, following a quiet rhythm that Amina could trust. Each day that followed, the fever eased a little more. His eyes grew clearer, his paws more restless, until one morning he tried to stand on the table, wobbling like a newborn, and gave a tiny, hoarse sound that might someday grow into a roar. When at last the time came, Amina carried him to the door one final time. Naima waited just beyond the porch, sitting still in the thin shade of the fence post, her scarred shoulder turned toward the clinic like a wordless reminder of all that had passed between them. As the door opened, she rose, every line of her body alert but gentle. Amina set Kito down at the threshold. For a moment he hesitated, caught between the remembered safety of the room behind him and the deep, familiar scent of the mother before him. Then he stepped forward, paws meeting dust, and pressed himself against Naima's legs. The lioness lowered her head and washed his face with slow, deliberate strokes, as if she were washing away every scent but their own. They did not look back as they left the yard. Yet over the weeks that followed, Naima returned again and again to the edge of the light. Sometimes, on windless nights, Amina would glance up from her work and see a shape in the tall grass, a tawny back, the gleam of eyes watching the road. The dogs in the neighboring village stopped barking at shadows. Word spread quietly among those who paid attention that the clinic seemed strangely safe, even when rumors of poachers crept closer. The men who had taken a picture that night did come back, following their marked map and their memory of a wounded lioness. They did not expect Samuel waiting with other rangers at the turn of the old track or the checkpoints that sprang up along their usual routes. The photograph that was meant to lead them to an easy hunt instead led them into open hands and firm questions. Their trucks were taken, their traps were pulled from the earth and stacked in rusting piles. Seasons shifted, grass grew taller, then faded and grew again. Kito became less of a cub and more of a lion with each passing moon, his steps longer, his shoulders broader. But the path between the wild and the little house never quite disappeared. From time to time, at dusk, Amina would step onto her porch and feel a prickle along her skin. Somewhere out there, in the thinning light, Naima stood, watching not with hunger, but with a quiet, steady claim. In the nearby villages, people began to speak in low voices about the story. They told their children of a night when a lioness had brought her dying cub to a doctor's door and left with him alive. Some said the lioness still guarded the place, keeping watch over the road as if it were part of her own territory. Amina knew better than to call it magic. To her, it was a debt paid in full. A life once saved returning to ask for help, and a life saved in return. Yet on certain nights, when thunder rolled far off and the sky flashed white, she would see Naima's outline, solid and calm against the flicker of the storm, and feel something loosen gently inside her chest. The clinic was no longer just a room full of medicine and metal. It was a place on the edge of two worlds, held between a woman's steady hands and a lioness's silent watch. And as long as Naima's shadow passed now and then across the threshold, the little house would never stand entirely alone. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this: do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.